legends. I hope that you are having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic week. Now this video is going to be a little bit different to usual. Now of course we're going to go over the usual stuff. We'll give some updates from Ukraine, we'll look at the maps, we'll talk a little bit there about some weapon systems and some evolution on maneuverable systems we're seeing enter the battlefield. But then near the end of the video, we're going to probably spend 10 or 15 minutes talking about potential imminent strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. We're going to talk about a little bit of the background there, nuclear capability, but also what realistically may be the effect of these strikes, because I think there is a bit of overestimation about how deep bunker busting munitions can actually go. And a lot of those depths, that is given just off dirt, not against rock reinforced concrete and then the layout of those bunkers themselves. So of course this video sort of got two parts, but we're going to go over all of it because of course the US is super involved, Russia's super involved, and then we have Israel and Iran. So a fair bit, so apologies if it is longer. So let's start with Ukraine. And what we have seen over the past 24 hours is some of these body exchanges are taking place. Now remember, this body exchange overall is going to be 6,000 for 6,000. And what we see the numbers being reported is that Ukraine's collected 1,212 bodies and that the Russians, they have received back 27 bodies. Now, of these 1,200 Ukrainian soldiers who have fallen, who have returned to Ukraine, they have said that only about 15% have been identified, and they're establishing the identity of these soldiers. At least that's the number, that 15% is what I am seeing. Now, this comes after a lot of allegations from both sides that the bodies and this exchange was being used as manipulation and political leverage, with Russia claiming that Ukraine did not want to receive the bodies to maintain the narrative of very small losses in this war of attrition, while also they were struggling to afford the over $2 billion worth of payments for the families of these returning due to the lack of identification, which would be 10% of Ukraine's entire military budget. But it does seem like this has then started, of that 6,000 for 6,000. But I think a lot of people are interpreting this data incorrectly. Now, I'm not saying there's nothing we can take out of it, but it's not what some are trying to claim. Now, 1,212 is over 48 times larger than the 27 figure that Russia has received back. What this does not indicate is this does not indicate the attrition rate at the front line. It's not 27x. But what we can take from that too is it does say that, look, the attrition rate of being in the other way of 10x is probably not realistic either. And why does Russia have significantly more Ukrainian bodies and Ukraine have significantly less Russian bodies? Well, in a war like this where you are grinding forward and it's not a war of maneuver anymore, it's still a war of attritional movement forward, well, Russia is moving forward and more Ukrainian bodies are going to get stuck in land that Russia moved through and Russian bodies on ground that they have moved through as well, so they can retrieve their own. That's just how being on offensive actions will work. But what I say is there's no really good information around the attrition rates and the rates of losses in this war. A lot of those figures, well, we know that it is fabricated for informational warfare. But we do know that losses are very, very high. And one thing this does show us, at least what I'm taking out of this, is that it does show some good faith between Ukraine and Russia, that Russia, at least in this, is willing not to exchange at a one-to-one. And we have seen in the previous several exchanges, it has been significantly more Ukrainian bodies than Russian. Now, likely there is some ulterior motive to this, given from the slide above about the payments and narratives, but at least that not just full on has to be then one-to-one. So as catastrophic as it is, losses in this war that will continue to climb, it is good to see that there is families getting their loved ones home and ability to put them to rest. Now, let's talk about Garand drones and Iskander missiles. So firstly, I want to show you this bit of footage here. I'll put this on the Telegram so you can have a watch of it completely. But what we see, I'll show you the geolocation in a second, but we see this is a telecommunications area, likely in a war like this, as it is in a state at war, used for a lot of military use for communications and the such. What we're looking at here is we'll see, this is in Ukraine, we see an Iskander then airburst striking this, which is common. Iskanders are very, very often used. But then we see the first Garand drone hit this, and then we'll see, I believe this is the second Garand hit. You can see that typical wing shape, and this is from the wrong side. And then we see the third Garand drone hitting that. And this is something that I've been speaking on a little bit recently, is this combined strategic tactical attack. Now, this is 40 kilometers from the border with Russia, Ukraine. So realistically, pretty close, considering the range of these weapon systems on that claimed communications control point. The Russian page, they say the missile hit with an airburst on the position precisely, and the Garand finished the job. Now, missiles like the Iskander, what we know is these are less susceptible to jamming and air defense than a Garand drone. But of course, this comes at a cost. You have far fewer of them, and they're far more expensive. And as I've been saying, as the Garand production increases, which we know it has gone 5 or 10-fold over the past couple of years, we will see more of these being used closer to the front in more of a tactical capacity. And this video displays what I believe has been happening for a while that we don't see due to the restrictions on filming any of these strikes. That the missiles create a breakthrough in the initial impact on target, and the cheaper, more numerous drones then attack through, or as this page would say, finish the job. Very similar to fiber optic drones. They will go for the electronic warfare systems, and then the traditional, cheaper, more numerous, then radio-controlled FPVs will then go through and target positions. So those being used hand in hand. Now let's sit on the Garand for a while. Now, Defense Express, they are reporting this. During the attack on Kyiv, the Russian Federation used a new Shahed or Garand rocket, probably the Russian production Garand 3. Now, a few things to look at here is, one, with the intake on top, this will then decrease its radar cross-section, but having any vertical stabilizers like this will increase it also. But you can see just the smoother body from then upgrades here will decrease this further. So completely stealth, no. Less cross-section, highly likely. Now, this is what we get here, is that you can hear from that whistle, that uncharacteristic of a Shahed attack. Now, I don't think that this is the jet drone, and we went over this and I was incorrect on this in the beginning. When we first heard that whistle, is that's not a jet sound. What that sound is, what they're saying is, because the fuselage has been updated on these and they're able to dive steeper, it's just that propeller motor going in like overdrive and then coming in, because they're coming steeper and faster. But what we do know is, from the aftermath of these, they did find a small jet engine, which seems to fit with something like the Garand 3. And we had seen that back in Iran in 23. There was, of course, this one is where the image is from. And likely Russia has made something of an analogue of this. Now, these upgraded drones, as we have gone over, these create many issues for Ukraine. Not only the targeting, but actually trying to defend against them as well. That the numbers we're getting from these is that they fly at 550 to 600 kilometers an hour and an altitude now of multiple kilometers, some of them at 3 or 4 kilometers high, which is out of the range of 50 cal and Gepard. Now, of course, as these target, they have to come through that height, but it means that your targeting team have a much shorter window to actually engage these. We also know that the warhead is larger, and it likely has a reduced radar cross-section, as well as the increased antennas that we have seen gone into a number of Russian systems that are not as susceptible to electronic warfare jamming. So I believe likely we've seen those enter, but at this point in time, wait out on more confirmation of that. There's many say, I've seen, that no, Russia doesn't have the components for the jet engine of this, and that is ridiculous. That Russia is one of the leaders in high efficiency turbine jet engines and has always been very, very competent at doing that. So no, if they're putting Tu-160s in the air and Su-34s, I guarantee the engines for these. And this is why we see that China adopts a lot of Russian engines, or used to at least, into a lot of their fighters. Now, let's have a look at the map before we talk about the evolution of then warfare and what is creating those movements. So here is Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv, and red areas since 22, purple since 2014. Now, there's no update on the deep state map today. Typically Thursdays they don't update, or they update late. I apologize for that. But of course we have the Syriac map and some geolocations as well. So let's start on the geolocations. Now, what I spoke to you about approximately 2 days ago was that we have seen near Kharkov the first time geolocated that the Russian forces have reached the border of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. Now, we have actually better footage of this today. So in this footage here, and I believe the flag we see at 140, 142 or 143. Now, as you know, sometimes I'm good with clicking in the direct spot. Nah, damn. Let's move through. Yep, so we see 145. We can see the Russian flag here. I believe we zoomed in on it a little bit before, if I can show this. We see that flag there. Drone zooms out, therefore the ability to then geolocate this position, of course, on then defensive works that were under Ukrainian control. And where this is geolocated is in here. Now, I want to show you something before we talk about the distance. And we can see this is where in the black, the border. Now, this is likely a reconnaissance sabotage Russian team. But the biggest concern here should be this is one of, if not the hottest area on the front line. And we have Russian troops moving multiple kilometers in this direction. That shows the thinness of Ukrainian defenses, manpower, and even drones and artillery to counter this also. And this shows exactly why the Russians can smell a weakness of these gains of multiple kilometers or smell blood in the water. And this can have huge morale effects also. So look, I measured from here at 5.08 kilometers, but this was, I believe, the 144th, who they are operating on the northern side of the Vovcha River here. So where I originally measured from, if I get this ruler, was the closest point here to the border here. Now, what I've been corrected on is no, Willie, they're on the north. It's likely not them there. So it's more from here to, well, they're on the northern side of the river by this map, 13 kilometers. Now, I know it's not that because we have a Russian geolocation about here. That's where that flag went up, Oleksivka. Likely, I think Oleksivka is under Russian occupation, especially from this footage and previous. But what we're seeing is this is still 5.5, 6 kilometers behind there. That is a long way. That is significant. And this whole area from Kharkov to Odrane is likely under occupation. We might see more pushing through into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. This is significant. There's soldiers right out in here. And those saying, it's only, a couple of kilometers. Well, the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023 in the maximum area was about 8 kilometers. Now, I know it's different. I know it's apples and oranges, but the people that were super excited on that, you still need to look at this is still significant. Multiple kilometers in a day. This isn't just positional warfare. And for those troops to be moving through these areas in an area that should be completely saturated, arty, drone, teams, defenses, that's more of a concern than just the kilometers for myself. And I think that is really serious. And then we'll look around this area again, Velika Novosilka, Bahatar front line. And again, the Pokrovsk area and Velika Novosilka area is beginning to merge into one. We'll look at the, Syriac map in here. And this is this area. This is Bahatar, and this is the breaking up here. So he has shown that these troops also that have reached have come from the south. But it seems that 144 there operating on the north. So again, we will see. But further movement down then this road. And where this has merged, as I spoke about, is that this is Komar, this is Odrane. So Syriac is saying that the Russians are right up down to this road. And then all the way through to Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. There's still to the north of Oleksivka, as you can sort of see on his, there's still an envelopment happening in here. But it is a lot tighter than this is appearing on here. So watch out on this. I think likely, given the nature of this war, that it is more of a stable line moving rather than just single spires coming out like this and like that there also. So let's then come just to the north of here and look on the Pokrovsk front. Again, I know it can be confusing because it's sort of sinking into one. As I say, don't look at my labeling on a lot of my slides. A lot of that is, or most of it is just to remind me of what I'm going to then speak about. So we have Hodorkovye here. We can see where the Russian forces have come up to the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast and more movement through here. As he says, Ukraine is starting to withdraw out of here, as well as more movement up in this direction just north of then Novomykolivka, that he says the Russians are also reaching Dnipropetrovsk Oblast in this direction here also, and further movement out near Udashne too. So I think we will start to see, we've seen at least 2, potentially 3 areas movement into this oblast, and that is important in the informational space. And at the end of the day, the informational space can really affect frontline, not only from psychology of the troops, but through the negotiations also. And what the Russians will use this as is they will say, well, we occupy areas in then 3 oblasts, of which we only want then to take the complete 4, that will hand back the areas we occupy in Dnipropetrovsk, in Sumy, and in Kharkiv for this. It is in the exact opposite of what Ukraine tried to do in Kursk. They knew they were never going to occupy all of Kursk, but they knew if they occupied a square inch of Kursk, that is going to be a lot more they'll get back for that than Russia will take in other areas, if that makes sense. The exchange rate on other areas is going to be much higher. Now let's come into Toretsk, an area I don't like talking about because it's so blurry what's actually happening in here. Again, I think we won't know a good amount on this until we see this whole envelopment here really start a withdrawal or squeeze on here, but it's worth keeping up with. And Suryak says this on this front: Ukraine army captured some positions at the center of Delivkia. So this is this Delivkia up here. Remember, there's 2 of them, but on northern Delivkia. This is where Russia pushed right out. This map's still not showing it, but we did have a geolocation a few kilometers back. Russian army took control of the remaining areas in this district as 2 adjacent Tedekons. He says 95% of the city is now under Russian control. Toretsk itself is very, very fluid. I think at one point the Russians probably occupied all of it, and then we saw Ukrainian counters really get that down to like 70%. But now moving forward, again, weighed out on exactly what we see. Now let's come up into the area that concerns me actually more than down in around Pokrovsk is this. Now, what I've said in here is Oskil in here. There's going to be no major crossings of this. Waterways, bane of the existence of any armour, infantry, artillery movements, any sort of movement like that. You're not mill floating across here with your fucking backpack in a sack. You're not doing that. Not to have real effect, okay? Not to launch offensives, but is where it's cut off in the north here. And now that it's reached Kapelivkia, that this area in here will be so saturated with drones, it could end up being a massive kill zone in here. And I won't be surprised to see many counters to try and unblock or push back the Russians on the Nove front here, or to try and unblock on what I'd refer to as really the Pashani front in here to create and alleviate the pressure. And we can see in here that in Lozova, which is just in here, that the Ukrainian army still control over some of the trenches here. So this is just a map correction, doesn't show any counter actions in here, but Surat correction. I think if we saw Ukrainian successful actions right up and around Lozovo, Vishneve, not be surprised at all to see movement back in here, because I believe the Russians will let some movement go there to buffer and create more of a larger area around Kharkivka here, and want Ukraine to funnel more assets and resources through this kill zone that they've made in here. Remember, attritional warfare is about having the best rate of attrition possible for your side. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that. Let's talk a little bit about losses. And for many years of this war, it was always seen that the Russian armoured losses are irrecoverable, and that by 23, then it turned into late 23, then it turned into 24, then it turned into late 24, and then it turned into 25. Sadly, of some of the most respected bloggers and YouTubers, that yes, Russia will run out of armour at this date. They cannot make more of it, therefore the war will be won. And what we know is those dates have been and gone, but somehow, I don't know how my audience holds me at account for basically everything I've ever said, and it seems like these audiences never hold anyone to account on what they have actually said. Like I saw a comment today, which is very rare on one of these channels, that said, well, every single video is Russia gets smashed here, Russia gets pushed back here, but then we look at the actual map and it's moving and moving. And these ones that said, yep, they will be out of tanks by then, it's fine to say, look, I was incorrect, I was going off information that I had at the time and that was incorrect. But it seems like that accountability is never taken. I know I've been wrong on as much as anyone else, but at least me and others try and bring that back. But the tank thing and the armoured vehicle thing is something which was promised as the winning capacity for Ukraine. And, well, unless they're making them out of washing machines, clotheslines, and what's the word I'm looking for? Shovels. Well, I don't know how they're getting made. Mark Rutte, we'll speak about that in a second, the NATO chief. Now, war spotting here. The monthly losses update is going to be super quick, since there's not much to say about May 25, other than the 214 documented Russian losses in Ukraine. That's an incredible 30% drop compared to April. Initially 303, now 330. Already quite unimpressive. And why he says initially, so initially in April is 303, a few weeks on, there's a dozen and a half, say, or a couple of dozen, more than a dozen and a half, couple of dozen that then get caught up. You catch up with that as more footage comes out. But what we can see is there has been a 30% loss in this of visually confirmed losses. I do not care what official pages just claim. Everything in this war is filmed. Everything is filmed, and everything will be used for propaganda victories. Okay, there's not secret footage of all these T90Ms or fucking T14s somewhere being hidden, or secret footage of over-the-top boys bloody blow the whistle meat wave attacks, because that will not be held back. It needs to be used for propaganda information, especially for Ukraine, where optics are so important. As a matter of fact, it's 1/3 of what it used to be some 6 months ago. Although, to be fair, October, November 24 was well above the average. What we can see here in May is this dropping of documented Russian losses. But of course, we can see October, November, really those primary months where the Russian kilometre squares were moving, being vastly higher. Even so, May 25 is currently the second lowest month since the beginning of the war, only next to April 23 at 209. Of course, expecting Ukraine's counter movement and not on offensive actions at the point. We expect it'll gain a couple of dozen losses over time, although it's unlikely to move far away from the bottom three. So let's have a look in this. Green's 22, blue's 23, yellow's 24, red 25. We can see May here, then the lack of armoured losses. And this tells us a lot. And we'll go over this in a sec. Last year, certainly, last month certainly doesn't feel that way. Additionally, let's consider this. May 25, they got 450 square kilometres and 214 losses, according to Deep State's numbers. October 24, the Russians got 503 square kilometres and 582 losses. So less than half the losses for similar amounts of kilometre squares. And what I'll take in this is 214 losses at the month, times 12. Talking 2,600, just under 2,600 losses a year. Now, that is a lot. I'm not saying that isn't a lot. But NATO Secretary-Chief Mark Rutte, he is saying that Russia is making over 3,000 armoured vehicles and 1,500 tanks as well. So even by these numbers, it's still meeting replacement on that. Now, it is unsure if the numbers that he gave is new or it is new and refurbished as well. But still, it's still a huge reduction there for very similar amounts of kilometre squares. And May 25 for Deep State was massively under the kilometre squares it probably was due to Sumy. So, yeah, okay, it's probably significantly more than that. Material losses have never truly been indicative of Russia's presumably decreasing capacity to wage war. Now, again, I don't know if Russia if it is indicative that Russia is presumably decreasing ability to capacity to actually wage war, because this is not what NATO is telling us. They're telling us that Russia's actually increasing their ability to wage war for then further assaults into NATO. And what I have said over multiple videos now is, would you rather fight 22 Russia or 25 Russia? And I think you'll find your answer there, although at least remained somewhat indicative of the intensity of offensive effort over a given period of time. Lately, and increasingly, they're not so much. And what this didn't do is this didn't stop the media and bloggers from counting on Russia's lack of armour being the end of the war. And remember, well, it was meant to run out in 2022. But absolutely, it was taken. I know it never was indicative of the capacity to wage war, but it was used informationally as, well, there's only got a couple more months of these left, and then it will be absolutely indicative of the ability to wage offensive war. But now it's showing that offensive effort, as per these numbers, it's not anymore, and even less. Armour seems less important now. And it's actual manpower that seems to move the needle for Russia as it exercises its advantage in this department. In a sense, drones took us some 500 years back, and drones, they have been a huge, huge issue for armoured manoeuvre warfare. Absolutely. There's still a place for armour, but it's absolutely less than it was. But what I'll say, in war, whether it was bows and arrows, armour, nuclear weapons, or fighter aircraft, manpower will still be the deciding factor in an attritional nature of war. And that doesn't mean just the manpower of the front line. It also means the industrial manpower, the logistics manpower, and the fighting manpower as well. So let's go into this last slide. We've got a little bit more. So same page. Last week holds 33 visually confirmed Russian losses in Ukraine. Not quite as low as the record-breaking week ago, with 26 initially and 30 now, but very much in the same ballpark. For a perspective, the same 7-day period before, 24, 150, 23, 67, 22, 74. And then we're looking the same week in 25, you're talking 30. That's very, very significant, if this makes sense. Now, what we can see is 214 over the month, last month, and it was 150 in a 7-day period in 24. Should be concerning, and this reflects evolution of the battlefield, where necessity remains the greatest driver of innovation, and to never discount the evolution of your enemy either under the huge pressure of warfare. And this is in response to growing drone and mine threats that Russia has shifted towards smaller, cheaper, faster, and more mobile vehicles. But what these numbers show us is they're able to still maintain the same amount or more kilometre squares per month. And it really goes against those earlier claims that once Russia's armour is gone, the manpower, then it won't matter to bring them into the fold, which again goes into, in the unbelievable, immense pressure of war, never discount your enemy's ability to then evolve. Yet no one mentions this anymore. And it's so many things that were back in the day propaganda that has now been accepted and that no one ever talks about. And the focus has shifted solely to troop attrition. And where all the effort is put now on that Russia will lose is only focused on troop attrition. And this is based most often on fabricated figures while turning a blind eye to your own losses. And this just distorts the reality. And absolutely, we can take lessons from this also. And the lesson to be learned here is what is working for Russia, who's advancing on the battlefield. And I see this every day, that the Russians have no good tactics, they've got no good weapons left, they've got none of this, none of this. Then explain why the front line is moving in their favour, okay? And in very important areas too. And it's not that Ukraine is pulling back and creating attrition, because we see again and again and again complaints from soldiers to commanders that we're not allowed to pull back to hold this area at all cost, especially with break-ins like I showed you earlier in Dnipropetrovsk. And what we see here, the lesson to be learned, is we have like a fixation on Abrams, on Leopards, on Charlies, and more of that. When we're looking at what is moving the battle, what is moving the line here, manpower, manoeuvrable weapons. And again, like we're trying to get all these Abrams through, it might just be too little, too late. So there's a lot in this, and that is some very concerning figures as well. Now, let's talk about Iran. And a lot of people may click off this at this point in time, and I just got demonetized for mentioning that state. So what we know is there may be imminent Israeli
attacks. And we have a lot of signaling that this could be the way. And this is from CBS. The US officials have told Israel, US officials have been told that Israel is fully ready to launch an operation into Iran. The US anticipates Iran could retaliate on certain American sites in neighbouring Iraq. This is part of the reason the US has advised some Americans to leave the region earlier Wednesday, with the State Department ordering non-emergency government officials to exit Iraq due to the heightened regional tensions. And the American embassy in Iraq, they are lowering their numbers there, and that is an absolute fortress. President Trump's Middle East Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is planning to meet with Iran for a 6th round of talks on the country's nuclear program in the coming days. US will not be happy if this goes before those talks, because they do want to, it does look like, at least publicly, they do want to have some level of negotiation, diplomatic settlement here, not firepower. Trump spoke about Iran, an appearance at the Kennedy Center. There's an interview just today, and he said, well, it could be a dangerous place. This is why Americans were told to leave. And he reiterated that we don't want to see Iran develop nuclear weapons, and he did say that we are not going to allow that. They said Israeli officials and White House spokesman declined to comment. And what we know is the Trump administration, they are looking for a deal to limit the country's nuclear program, as international watchdogs say the country has continued to enrich uranium to near weapons level. Now, what we have been hearing is that we've heard that Iran has been on the eve of creating nuclear weapons now for decades. Now, the talks are delicate, and it's unclear how close the two sides are to a deal. Trump said he will not accept any uranium enrichment by Iran, but Iranian leaders have indicated they won't accept those terms. Netanyahu's office says Israel has conducted countless overt and covert operations to stunt the growth of Iran's nuclear program. Last month, Trump said publicly he had urged Netanyahu not to strike Iran while his administration pursues negotiations on the regime. I told him this would be inappropriate to do right now because we're very close to a solution. Now, will we see this go forward anyway? I don't know. So this is from Rusi back in the 21st of March 25. The challenges involved in military strikes against Iran's nuclear program. While strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities are often cast in the light of avoiding escalation, underlying all considerations is the efficacy of military actions. So, yes, it's cast in the light of, yep, we're avoiding escalation by doing this, but what may become of this? Then we see this truism that decisively destroying the Iranian nuclear program using military means is not possible, and that even limited strikes would be risky and of limited effectiveness. Yet technical assessments of these claims remain limited. Of course, a lot of this will be top secret or it's buried 100 metres below the ground, but let's have a look at this. A number of key potential targets, including this fuel enrichment plant, the FEP at Natanz, and the Fordo fuel enrichment plant, the FFEP, are located underground. Now, some of these other ones that could be used for uranium enrichment and to cause meaningful damage to these underground facilities would require significant firepower, which presents escalatory risk and potential challenges. The precise depth of Iran's underground facilities are not publicly known. Estimates drawn from public reporting and analysis are included in Table 1. And this is where many have suggested and speculated that there will be more of a special operations mission instead. Now, I've spoken on that very quickly before and said, look, this going down into a facility like this, well behind lines in a country as well armed as that, that's Hollywood level SF operations rather than maybe the reality of intelligence operations on collecting and exploiting some of that as well. You never know, but it would be a one-way trip. Now, this chart here is a summary of Iranian underground enrichment and centrifuge production facilities. Now, what we need to remember is the largest ordnance here as far as bunker busting or massive ordnance penetrator, also what I call myself, is capable of reaching depths of 61 metres or 200 feet. Okay? Again, as you'll see, Israel doesn't have this resource. Anyway, let's have a look at some of these. This FEP depth here, we're talking that it's various around 8 metres, then there's 2.5 metres of concrete to a 22 metres of earth covering it, reinforced concrete. So you can see these are incredibly deep. Some parts, of course, are going to be shallower than others, but you've got areas with metres of reinforced concrete and tens of metres of earth as well. This FFEP is unknown, estimated 80 to 90 metres underground. Some of these, that like 80 to 100 metres, likely deeper. So you can see just the amount of firepower that would be needed to get through this. The penetration achieved with each weapon will vary greatly, depending on the material covering each target. A weapon that can penetrate through tens of metres of packed earth or sand may only penetrate a few metres of standard civilian construction-grade concrete. This is what you need to know, is a lot of the numbers given are through just earth, not into concrete, reinforcement, hard rock, etc. And even less reinforced, high-density concrete. Furthermore, most of Iranian facilities are likely to be covered by different layers of reinforced concrete, rock-packed earth, potentially other materials. The layer of the facility in question is also important for assessing weapons design for the point of impact. So, of course, they're going down in one spot. For instance, a buried facility that has rooms connected by long, narrow shafts with multiple sets of brick blast doors, a thick blast door, and multiple external entry and exit points would be much harder to guarantee destruction of than a buried facility that has one large cavern or a single entry and exit shaft. So you're talking about if there's just one big facility underground that's just a room and you get something into that, yes. But if it's multiple rooms connected by long shafts in different areas and it comes down and goes out, you may collapse a few, but you're never going to get all of it, at least if there's any sort of limited then strikes. And this is one of the tables here, which is very, very interesting. So penetration here through concrete, and we have a look at this is that then mass ordnance here, that GBU 57, but what's carrying it is B-2 Spirits, B-1, B-21 Raiders, so it would have to be dropped by the US. We have GBU 72, around 10 metres here, of course, unknown. We're talking F-15s, likely to be able to be dropped by Israel. Maybe, I'm not sure, but we know GBU 28s, they can be. You're talking 6 metres. That the Air Laura, these around 6 metres, they can be dropped by the F-16s, and there's a number of other ones here, but you can see the issue in this. It doesn't mean that they can't penetrate. What it means is it's going to be a lot more. So even at the FEP, assuming the sites are located roughly 8 metres underground and covering is predominantly reinforced concrete or hard rock, all the weapons available to the Israeli Air Force and all except 30,000-pound GBU-57 and the 5,000-pound GBU-72 available to the United States would likely require several impacts in the same crater to burrow down to the facility and get a weapon through to explode within it successfully. So you've got to dig and dig and dig down. And what this what this does is it puts a lot of planes in the air, and the more planes in the air, more risk of air defences as well. For the new facility at Natanz, an estimated 80 to 100 metres, possibly with layers of reinforced concrete, I'd say definitely, even the GBU-57 would likely require multiple impacts at the same point. So you can see why this is going to be a huge problem, that you may see strikes at entry and exit tunnel points, but again, you're going to be able to then dig this back out. However, unless a longer-term campaign were mounted with regular follow-up strikes, efforts to dig down to the facilities and re-establish access and supplies would likely begin almost immediately. So to actually dismantle this force is difficult. It's actually then more difficult than just collapsing these. Limits the military counter-proliferation option. The practical challenge of carrying out attacks against dispersed or hardened facilities makes clear the infeasibility of relying strictly on military solution to the threat posed by Iran's nuclear program. That is likely necessitating a major operation to penetrate hardened facilities and to degrade Iranian air defences. Now, in the Iranian nuclear program, including extensive latent enterprise with the Iranian scientific community. So this is one of the problems, is this is highly dispersed and advanced state of the science community here as well. So even if you destroy these areas by military means, that expertise still remains in their scientific community. And this complicates the actual effort to eliminate the program. For these reasons, any comparisons with Israeli attacks against Iraq's Orisik reactor in 81 or Syria's Al-Kabar facility in 2007 are highly misplaced. In both attacks, the country's programs were highly concentrated at a nascent stage, relying extensively on foreign assistance for their development. So they didn't have the local domestic knowledge. They were relying on foreign assistance. So if you can destroy these, then it's gone. But again, this is held within the state too. Following any military strike on its nuclear sites, Iran not only has the requisite indigenous expertise, but also have an increased incentive to rebuild and to rebuild deeper and more hardened facilities. We'll talk about
incentive following this also. The destruction of Iran's nuclear program by military means is not feasible, and even limited strikes carry significant escalatory risks. This does not negate the value of issuing credible military threats as part of a broader effort to roll back the Iranian nuclear program. Should Iran's nuclear program reach a stage where it poses a threat beyond what is acceptable to Israel or the US. To Israel, that any of this they will say pose a threat. For instance, if intelligence was obtained that Iranian decision to rush towards a nuclear weapon, or if Tehran decided to begin uranium enrichment to 90%, military attacks could be used to set the program back to a more acceptable stage and may be assessed as being worth the escalatory risks. So never letting it get high enough that you're just always keeping a lid on it. But what I've said is I think Israel's over trying to keep a lid on it, that they are looking for an excuse to fully dismantle this, to not have to deal with it in the future, and wanting US backing it, making clear the willingness to carry out such attacks, but only as an option of last resort, could help exert necessary pressure to convince Tehran to cooperate with expectations not to cross certain thresholds or reverse course on particularly destabilising activity. Such threats that would entail such serving as a sobering reminder that they should not be issued lightly. So if you're putting out these threats, you need to know that this is still very, very major. Now, what we know is the Kremlin has signalled, and in past weeks as well, they've signalled on multiple occasions that they are willing to work with Trump and that they are not a fan of having nuclear weapons in Iran. And Dmitry Peskov, Kremlin spokesman, has said if necessary, if the parties deem it necessary, Russia will be ready to provide such services to help Iran remove excess nuclear fuel from the country. Again, this all goes into this large diplomatic bloody, what's the word I'm looking for? Like recipe that is getting made, of course, between the US and Russia, that you can scratch your back, I can help you here and there, that it's far beyond, and this is where there can be de-escalation, escalation, and increased relationships as well. Expressing that Russia is in constant contacts with Iran. We know there's a lot of communication there as well. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov told journalists that Moscow is ready to assist on the matter both politically and practically. Now, we know this has not been the first signalling of this, and we do know the Trump administration, they want to find a solution to Iran's nuclear program. And as I've discussed for several years, though, one of the most significant cards that Russia holds, well, the most significant cards Russia holds is its nuclear arsenal, but one of the other cards it holds is the research development capacity of those nuclear weapons. And the threat that there is of potentially a state like Russia handing over some of that information to anti-Western states, particularly, say, North Korea, Iran, who are looking for those systems. And I have said for many, many years, this is a serious concern in areas like Washington, and is being given very careful consideration of the escalation, not towards Ukraine, but the escalation to threaten the Western states, or to threaten them to reduce their support to Ukraine by potentially then endangering a lot of Western interests in, say, the Middle East, with helping from groups to states that are not in the Western sphere of influence or are aggressive against the West. And I've spoken about this before, that if it gets really desperate and Russia says, oh, look, okay, we want to actually have more ties with Iran and we want to help them nuclearize. Now, I'm not saying that's not what the Kremlin is saying at all, but if they said that, it would send shock waves through the US and their closest ally of Israel. Now, it is estimated, Israel is very ambiguous with their nuclear systems. But it's estimated they possess around 90 nuclear warheads. And this makes it the only state in the Middle East with nuclear weapons. Not the only state that wants them, the only one actually with them. Now, Israel will do whatever is necessary and justify whatever is necessary to maintain dominance of nuclear dominance in this region. And as I've said for many years, I believe that war with Iran, for the US and Israel and probably everyone else that will get drawn into it, is a matter of when, not if. And Israel's looking at this going, well, we would need to do this before they would get a level of mass destruction like this. I wish that it's easy to walk to the edge. It's very difficult to pull back from that edge as well. And I don't personally agree with Iran having nuclear weapons.
I don't want them to have nuclear weapons being the state that it is. But we have to look at this from an objective stance as well. Israel is likely aiming to directly target a sovereign state's nuclear facilities. The logical response to this, of your nuclear facilities getting struck, is then to further develop that capability and not work within negotiations. And as per doctrine, as per everyone's doctrine on strikes against nuclear facilities, respond in kind to that. Like I said, it's very easy to walk to the edge. Once you're off it, you can't come back over the edge, okay? Now, this will never happen. But the reasonable response and negotiations in this, for where the US should be sitting, I believe, and the other great powers around the world, is no nuclear weapons in the Middle East, including in Israel. This whole area, no nuclear weapons. And then the great powers, US, India, China, Russia, those great nuclear powers, that they then work to enforce non-nuclear proliferation around the world. And especially in these areas where we constantly see warfare. And also, in part of that, guarantees of response if there is development or strikes as well. But that's very, very optimistic of myself. What do I think of a byproduct of many tensions around the world at the moment? I think the nuclear non-proliferation is going to be absolutely thrown out of the window. I think we'll see far more nuclear weapons in Europe now that their nuclear umbrella of the US is not 100% guaranteed. I think it was naive to think it was ever 100% guaranteed. And in areas of the Middle East and other areas too, in Asia, we will see nuclear weapons further developed. I think we'll see that everywhere. And I've said if I was not the Australian Prime Minister, he wouldn't have the power, but if I was the Australian dictator, shit would be way more fun in Australia. But if I was the president of Australia with executive power, or a dictator in Australia, the first thing I'd be looking at is developing nuclear weapons, because I'd say we're never going to have the latent or potential power. So latent power of what do we have now? Potential power of GDP and manpower. We're never going to have that to compete with countries on our border. We're never going to have it to compete with Indonesia in the future. And we're definitely never going to have it to compete with China. Other than a signature on a bit of paper, how confident are we on our allies' support? I don't know. I'd take lessons from Ukraine, lessons from other areas, and go, look, I want to develop a nuclear deterrence. Sit it in the middle of the outback and come and get this smoke. Thing is, once you get into arms races like this, well, then New Zealand may look and go, well, what the fuck have you got them for? We want to develop it. Then Indo may, and all the way through. So I think that's my prediction over the coming couple of decades, that we will see far more nuclear weapons enter the world than far less. In net, it's probably going to be less, because the US and Russia have decided, well, they know they don't need in the tens of thousands. So net may be less, but the countries that have them or looking to develop will potentially become more. Again, of course, become way more deadly with things like hypersonic, re-entry vehicles, all that sort of shit. So maybe the solution here isn't no nuclear weapons in the Middle East. Maybe it's fucking having every country with nuclear weapons in there, that Israel has them, Iran has them, Saudi has them, or everyone has them, and it's Cold War 2.0 again. Again, I don't think there's the amount of reservation to not use them in some of these states also. So we'll see. Legends, I hope you have a fantastic day. Apologies for the long video again, but I enjoy it, and I hope if you've made it to here, you've enjoyed it too. I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.